Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you might be joining us from. Welcome to today's discussion with Alan Ronkin from AJC. I am David Inoue, the Executive Director for JACL, and will be moderating the conversation here today. If you do have questions for us, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will try to get to them. Please also let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat, as both JACL and AJC have a global reach with our membership. It's always nice to see how far some folks are tuning in from. It's especially timely that we have this discussion today, as we saw this past weekend the horrific attack at the University of Kentucky during the lighting of the menorah, where if you had not heard about this, someone drove up to the event, began shouting anti-Semitic slurs and other vulgarities at the attendees. One of the participants then approached the driver, and the driver actually grabbed him and dragged this individual for a block before releasing him, and actually drove over his leg afterwards and then took off. And as far as I know, I don't believe they've even found the individual yet. So it is because of incidents like this that it requires us to have this discussion today. So first, let me introduce Alan. Alan Ronkin has an over 30-year career working in advocacy and within the Jewish community in the cities of Los Angeles, Cleveland, Seattle, and Boston. He focuses on relationship building and policy development to support a society that reflects the best of Jewish values, including support for Israel, equity, and appreciation of differences. In his long career, he has built relationships with numerous community leaders, including elected officials, clergy, and of course, organizations such as JACL. He's a native of Bridgeport, Connecticut, earned a Master's of Public Administration from the University of Southern California, a Master's in Jewish Communal Service, and a doctorate in Jewish Nonprofit Management from Hebrew Union College, and also has a BA from Yeshiva University. Alan, we're very pleased to have you join us for this discussion. Now, some of our audience might not be familiar with AJC. Can you maybe tell them a little bit about your organization? How does it fit in, and also distinguish itself from other Jewish advocacy organizations that exist and that we also work with? Oh, you're on mute.
Of course I am. Thank you, David. It really is great to be with you today. JACL is really a longtime partner of the American Jewish Committee, AJC, and we're really honored to have an opportunity to talk to your membership and to folks really around the world about what's going on. AJC, think of AJC as a global Jewish network of advocates, educators, ambassadors, and diplomats. We are in 12 countries around the world, soon to be 13. Have 24 offices here in the United States. And were founded in 1906 to address some of the most difficult times for the Jewish people, the beginning of the communal attacks called pogroms in Eastern Europe. And when we went in 1906 to advocate with our government on behalf of the Jews, we very quickly found that if we didn't advocate on behalf of all, we wouldn't get very far. And so AJC for the last 114 years has tried to address those issues of most concern to the Jewish community, but the broader community as well. We are a values-based organization, pride ourselves on nuance and nonpartisanship. So I think that's really the scope of AJC. I serve as our regional director here in Washington, and am involved in a number of things, including fighting anti-Semitism, standing up for Israel's place in the world, but primarily we are relationship builders. And this relationship, this opportunity to talk is a great example of that.
And just to further inform those, particularly on the JACL side, that when we were pursuing redress many years ago, AJC was one of the first organizations to really step up and say this was something that was needed. So that really, I think, really solidified our ties to your organization, and something for which we are forever going to be grateful for. We're here today because you recently released your 2020 report on anti-Semitism in the United States. Now, this year's survey was a little bit different from the one you did last year, in that it actually captured general public attitudes in addition to those of the Jewish community. What were some of the most striking differences that you saw in perception between within the Jewish community, but also compared to the general public that you found in the survey?
Well, the first, really striking difference was the perception of anti-Semitism in the United States. Is it growing? Is it a problem? 88% of the Jewish community felt that anti-Semitism is growing. It's growing over the last couple of years, and that is a serious problem. Among the general public, only 19% thought that it was a serious problem. And the second trend line in terms of growth, 14% of the general public believes that anti-Semitism is on the decrease. And that's after the attacks in places like Pittsburgh and Poway, Muncie, New York, Jersey City. And 39% believe that anti-Semitism remains the same. The other striking difference is that when it comes to anti-Semitism, there's a significant portion of the general public who has either never heard the word or doesn't know what it means. And so that points to the need for education and to let people know what's going on out there. Of course, when you tell them what anti-Semitism is, they understand it. The hatred of Jews, the perception of Jews is not foreign to people. But the idea that anti-Semitism is not well known is a significant problem. Third, the survey indicated that some 60+% of the general public believe that if a Jewish person or a Jewish organization tells them something is anti-Semitic, it actually doesn't move the needle and make them think it's anti-Semitic. And in fact, 7% of the population said it was less likely to make them think it was anti-Semitic. Now, one could argue, the 65% or so might think, well, I already know what anti-Semitism is. I don't need anybody to tell me what anti-Semitism is. But, that may not be the case. It may just be that the Jewish community is not seen as the arbiter of its own discrimination. We would never tell the Black community, for example, what is racism, or the Muslim community about Islamophobia, or the Asian community about Asian bias. We would believe them. If someone tells you something is offensive or hurtful, you generally should tend to believe them. When it comes to anti-Semitism, that doesn't appear to be the case for a very significant portion of our country.
I think that really does. You sort of start off talking about partnership, and that's where it is so important for us all as partners to amplify and to support our partner organizations when they are identifying that this is something that's wrong. I think that's something that we all do here at the national level here in Washington, D.C., and certainly encourage our local members to also do in the local community when something happens. That it's not the responsibility of one group to carry the message of when something is hurtful, when something is wrong. That we do all need to stand up together to do that, and that's obviously a lesson that AJC learned very early on, as did JCL through our own incarceration experience. That it was the lack of support from many other organizations and groups that did allow that to happen back then. And we've certainly learned the lesson today as we all stand up together. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
Yeah, hate and bigotry are not the responsibility of the victim alone to get rid of. It's a general societal problem. And if we leave it to the victims of discrimination to solve their own problem, it's never going to work, and we do them a tremendous disservice.
And just to go back to another thing you mentioned, I'm just amazed at how many people could not identify that an anti-Semitic act had happened in the past 5 years. I think that it was 52% of the general public was not familiar with any acts of anti-Semitism in the past 5 years. And you named several of them that have happened. And obviously, just this past weekend, we had that event in Kentucky, the Anne Frank incident, also within the past week even. And just And it's not like these things don't happen. It's amazing that people are not aware, or perhaps are not making that connection that these are anti-Semitic acts.
Yeah, I mean, according to the FBI statistics that just came out in November, um, there were over 1,000 hate crimes committed against Jews in 2019. That's an average of 3 a day. Now, that's a lot. Now, we're very lucky that only, approximately 3% are violent, but that's 3% too many. And that there are 3 hate crimes per day affecting the Jewish community, people need to know.
And those are just crimes. And the one
Yes,
thing
that's
about
right.
the FBI reporting is that, as we've seen in the Asian American community, since COVID, there have been over 3,000 incidents reported. Now, those don't always rise to the level of a crime, but are oftentimes the precursor. Take, for example, the event in Lexington that started out as him shouting slurs and basically yelling, which is something that would not rise to the level of crime, but quickly escalated to what's clearly a crime now at this point. So oftentimes we need to recognize that yes, sticks and stones may break your bones, but calling names can also lead to that. So
Yes.
we can't just leave it as it's just name calling. It oftentimes is a precursor to the more significant event. Um, One of the challenges for any minority group is that perception of otherness. After the war, for example, Japanese Americans tried to oftentimes purge any outward signs of Japanese cultural practices and really embrace the idea of I'm going to be American, I'm going to join the Boy Scouts and try and fit in. Um, so, and yet today, there are a lot of Japanese Americans who are embracing their ethnic heritage. For example, my own children, we gave them both Japanese given names. Although, as you can see in my case, as with your own son, have a very traditional Jewish name, actually. But what is a more Western name? But one of the findings of the survey was that a lot of times Jews today could try to still hide a lot of the outward signs of their Jewishness. And oftentimes it's because of those safety concerns. Could you share a little bit about some of the fears faced by Jews today when they display their faith outwardly or attending community events or even attending synagogue on Shabbat?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, David. 1 in 4 in the survey reported hiding their Jewishness at least once in the last 2 years because of fear. And by hiding their Jewishness, it could be something as minor, as wearing a Star of David or wearing the kippah, the traditional yarmulke, um, taking it off out of fear to walk down the street being visibly Jewish. When you go to my synagogue, Adas Israel on Connecticut Avenue, um, I think we've got more security than the airport uh, because we're terribly concerned about another Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was not the first time that a Jewish synagogue was attacked, and we are going to do everything we can to make sure that our people are very, very safe. Now, we're not as concerned. I think, like you said, David. I mean, our kids, I don't think are as concerned about fitting in, quote unquote, as we were 50 years ago when it was a different America. That having been said, sometimes we even fit in too well. And the extremists feel a need to identify us and sort of smoke us out. I don't know if you're familiar with the echo symbol on Twitter. It's the 3 parentheses that go around Jewish names. And they're used by white supremacists to identify and harass Jewish journalists, Jewish, Twitter folks, and to really dox them, which is to put their names and addresses and phone numbers on the internet and put them and their families in danger. So people are actively trying to find the Jews, which is terribly scary, terribly scary.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you attend Adas Israel. Actually, we went to the Friday evening services after the Tree of Life um, attack, and yeah, and that's not something I have to deal with when I go to church. We don't have
Right.
metal detectors at the door. We don't have a police presence out in front of our church when I attend on Sunday mornings. It is something I think many of us just don't comprehend as non-Jews, what is going on in this day and age when we think those things should not be happening in the United States. And we think, oh, that happens in other countries, but not here where we have supposed religious freedom.
Right.
When we talk about kind of hiding our culture, another part of that is sort of the challenge of loyalty, and that was obviously what happened with Japanese Americans. There was the question of our loyalty during the war, and yet today there are still oftentimes charges towards Jewish people of where are your allegiances? Are you supportive of the U.S. government, or are you supporters of Israel? Can you explain how this, and this came through in the survey in several different ways, I noticed.
Yeah. Well, we asked a series of questions about anti-Semitism linked to Israel. And while Jews and the general public do tend to agree that anti-Zionism, which is the denial of Israel's right to exist, is anti-Semitic, there's a great divergence when talking about things like Jewish quote unquote money or other conspiracy theories related to Israel, particularly the question of dual loyalties. Only 50% of the public believes that accusing Jews of dual loyalties is anti-Semitic. Now, it's interesting. We see these things play out, as you said, in the political realm all the time. Being questioned, being thought of as somehow conflicted Americans. And, the idea, of course, is that Israel has a right to exist. The Jewish people have a right to a state in our ancestral homeland. Doesn't mean that those of us who don't live there aren't loyal to our countries. And in fact, the Jewish community has been extremely loyal to the United States. And I believe that the vast majority of the time, the interests of Israel align very well with the interests of the United States. And when they don't, they have to work it out. The government to government needs to work it out. Israel being a very strong ally of the United States, they need to work out with the U.S. government how to get into alignment. And so it is very troubling when you hear members of Congress, when you hear other people accuse us of dual loyalties, because it is very dangerous, as we said before.
Mhm. Yeah, and sort of along those lines, and another topic is that of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement, which I think has become a part of pretty much any discussion about Israeli and Palestine, the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Can you maybe first, I think there might be some people on the call who don't even know what BDS is, so maybe talk a little bit about what exactly it is. And then what did your survey also reveal about attitudes about BDS?
Well, David, you're absolutely right. BDS is not so well known among the general public. Only 5% say that they have a good understanding of it. Another 20% say they may have heard of it, but really don't understand it. And a very significant portion believe, those who do know about it, believe that there are at least anti-Semitic supporters, or that the movement is mostly anti-Semitic. So what is the BDS movement? BDS movement was created in 2001, right before 9/11. And it seeks to delegitimize Israel through the use of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. Its stated goal is the elimination of the Jewish state by making Israel a pariah and choking off its economy. Now, some people, are supportive of BDS because they believe that somehow it's going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and it's going to result in two states for two peoples. And we at AJC are very committed to the concept of a negotiated two-state agreement, understanding that it's going to take a real lot of work to establish trust and to make any progress in that. BDS rejects that as a matter of principle. One of their main slogans, for example, is "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And that means from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean, not leaving any room for the state of Israel. So that's that's sort of the BDS primer. Do you have other questions about that, or?
Yeah, and you mentioned the two-state solution as what AJC is promoting, I guess. How do we achieve that without, as far as what leverage do we have to try and convince Israel to move towards that, and obviously the Palestinian side as well, that there are two parties involved here, and how do we try and do that? Obviously, BDS is intended as a tool to try and obviously move Israel towards changing its policy and accepting perhaps a two-state solution. But how might we achieve that in lieu of using those types of levers that would obviously be present in the economic sanctions and divestment and so on?
Yeah, I would actually argue that there are plenty of peace movements out there who don't believe that isolating and delegitimizing Israel is a good way to get it to come to the table. The BDS movement, as I said before, really isn't interested in a negotiated two-state agreement. In order to get there, which is US stated policy, it's Israel's stated policy, I believe it's also the policy of the Palestinian Authority, you have to build trust between the parties. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since the heyday of the 90s, when we all thought peace was at hand. You talked about leverage. It's very interesting. The Abraham Accords, the set of normalization agreements that were brokered by the Trump administration that brought countries like the UAE and Morocco and others, Bahrain, Sudan, to normalize relations with Israel, I think actually provide a great opportunity to make progress on peace with the Palestinians. I'll tell you why. Pretending that Israel doesn't exist did not give the Arab countries any power to influence Israel, because they had no relationship with Israel. If you're an Arab country now sitting at the table, if you're the UAE or if you're Morocco or whoever, you have the opportunity to talk with your Israeli interlocutors. You have the ability to say to them, hey, this relationship is great. This is really important. What are you doing to solve the issue with the Palestinians? Palestinians have more allies that are connected to Israel now than they've ever had. And I think it's an opportunity to bring both parties to the table, because the UAE can also say to the Palestinians, hey, you need to get to the table. Look at what our relationship with Israel has done for us. Let's see if we can extend that benefit to Palestinian people. And I think that's a really good start. I think that's a way to move the process forward. It's going to take a lot of work. There's not a lot of trust right now between the leadership and the street. Israel's about to go to its fourth election in the last 2 years, which says a lot about its electoral and its political situation. Palestinians haven't gone to elections in, I believe, 16 years. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is serving year 16 of his 4-year term. And so you can see that there is a lot of discord within the Palestinian community as well. You've got warring factions between the more secular Palestinian Authority and Hamas, which is the Iranian-based Islamist, political Islamist extremist group that is, in Gaza, but is also in the West Bank. They need to figure out how to get their house in order, and that's going to be very difficult when it comes to the negotiation with Israel. I think time will also play a factor here. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas is 86 years old. So time may also have a great impact on, resolving the conflict.
I think that
long answer to a short question.
No, I think that how you close that out actually is oftentimes the answer to a lot of our problems today, actually, as we see younger generations coming up and having different perceptions of just even why do we even have a problem here? Why can't we just get along in some ways? And we even see it within our own Japanese American community sometimes, as we have younger Japanese Americans coming up and really asking why do we still have these conflicts in our community that have existed for so long,
Right.
and hopefully that can change. I we've sort of kind of diverged a little bit. We're fundamentally more domestic organizations, and we've kind of veered off into international issues. But pulling back into sort of the domestic side, uh, obviously you've done this survey. A lot of other organizations produce a lot of other data about what's happening with hate and around anti-Semitism, anti-Asian, and so on. Obviously, this past year I mentioned with the increase in incidents against Asian Americans, oftentimes unfortunately instigated by a president who has wanted to tie the COVID virus to Chinese people. Um, you mentioned the FBI and its survey. Um, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously we've seen increases through that, and what is the value of that in concert with this, with the survey that you've also conducted?
Well, the FBI statistics bear out what the perceptions of the Jewish community are, that there's a rise in anti-Semitism, that it's a serious problem. Um, it's up, over last year. I don't remember off the top of my head what the percentage is, but it's a good number going up. And when folks are concerned that perhaps the Jewish community is not overreacting, but certainly has our concerns are misplaced, the FBI tells us they're not. Now, the other thing to know about the FBI statistics is they are really underreported. There are many cities in this country, over 100,000 people, that report no hate crimes. This year, Baltimore, Richmond, Roanoke, and Norfolk reported no hate crimes here in our region. Listen to this. The district, okay, reported approximately 200 hate crimes last year. The state of Florida, 30 million more people, reported 141. Now, something's out of whack here. One of the things that I think I know we share, is a commitment to the No Hate Act. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But the No Hate Act is a piece of legislation that would help the FBI and help local law enforcement do a better job of reporting and recording these crimes, because we can't prosecute things. The FBI can't go after people if they don't know the crime took place.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said earlier, anti-Semitism comes from a variety of sources. It comes from the hard left, it comes from the hard right, it comes from radicals in the name of religion, and it also comes out of ignorance, which is something we're starting to grapple with. We used to think it was a three-headed hydra. Now we're realizing it's a four-headed hydra, that people just don't know about what it is is offensive, and how people are hurt, and what, as you said earlier, can come from the sticks and stones, to real violence. So I think that is a significant part of it, and something we really do need to pay very close attention to.
You had mentioned, and that comes from the hard left, hard right. I think when people think of anti-Semitism, they think of, oh, it's the Nazi march in Skokie or whatever. That it's the obvious thing. How else do we see it? Coming from it's a nonpartisan hate that it can come from all places.
Yeah, it's anti-Semitism is unique, if you will, because it's both ancient and modern hatred. Jews have been accused of being, at the same time, communists, undermining the society, and capitalists, undermining the society. Somehow, we're lower than rats, and we're subhuman, and at the same time we own the banks and the media, and it's a world Jewish conspiracy to control everything. So we get it from all sides. We get it, Charlottesville was a great example of the radical right, marching with their hateful messages about Jews, about other ethnic minorities. So you see that on your TV. What I think a lot of people don't see is the attack of the radical left. And the radical left is about more subtle. We talked a little bit about it earlier in terms of anti-Zionism. People who make the case that somehow Jews don't have a right to a homeland, that Jews are responsible for the actions of a foreign government, that somehow we individually have that level of guilt. And that also devolves into a climate where Jews are excluded, discriminated against. On college campuses, it's a very big deal. Students being harassed all the time if they have Zionist views, if they support Israel. So we see it there as well. And of course, in the name of religion, we know that there have been all too many attacks, both here and around the world, by militants who believe they're acting on behalf of God. So it's not so easy out there right now to sort out where things are coming from. But we have to act on all fronts. We have to have strategies and friends on all fronts that can stand up with us to alleviate and to make this problem better.
We actually have a question that just came in, which is kind of along this line, asking about to what degree is anti-Semitism actually systemic? That it's something that's been very much endemic to our culture, particularly in Western European culture.
It's an excellent question. And I think we are talking about Western culture. In the Eastern cultures, there isn't anti-Semitism in the classical way. I'm reluctant to say that there is systemic anti-Semitism because I think that implies that the halls of government are undergirded by an anti-Semitic feelings and all of that. I don't see that as a challenge that we are facing, but there are systems that are inherently anti-Semitic. And we do see them from time to time crop up. It's better than it once was, but anybody who goes to the internet today, I can tell you, for example, on 4chan, which is one of the Reddit boards, or I'm going to get this wrong because my internet knowledge is not what my son's is.
That's a good thing you're not on those sites.
No, it isn't. It is a good thing I'm not on those sites because what I'm told by one of the researchers that I work with is that the word kike, which is a defamatory term against Jewish people, is mentioned something like 40,000 times a day. So someone out there is obsessed with Jews, and not in a good way. And we're deeply concerned about it.
I appreciate your kind of distinction between maybe that it's not a systemic issue, but maybe the word that I used earlier, endemic, because I think it does sort of distinguish, for example, what African Americans experience with systemic racism, where it is such a part of the socio-political structures to actually discriminate, whereas it's not so much perhaps structural for Jews, but it is very much cultural, certainly. But
right. I mean, it is built in. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. It's built in to ancient Christianity, and the Christian Church over the years, both Catholic and Protestant, has grappled with the charge, of Jews killing Jesus, and deicide is what they call it, and we have suffered from religious persecution for over 2,000 years as a result of that. Now, 60 years ago, 55 years ago to be exact, the Catholic Church in Vatican II, which was a proclamation by the Church about how to deal with other religions, made a definitive statement that Jews are not responsible collectively for the killing of Christ. That was a huge sea change in theology. The Protestant churches as well have backed off of that of that concept. But, how much that gets into the pews and what is taught in individual churches, it has to evolve, and it takes a while to get this message across. I mean, I remember as a kid, and I grew up in a neighborhood that was primarily Italian and Irish Catholic. And I remember on a regular basis being, called out, as a Christ killer. And, when I was a kid, I mean, I didn't know anything about Christianity. I mean, I grew up as a Jewish kid. I knew what I saw on TV and in my friends' houses. But Christ killer was a new one for me. And I asked my dad about it. I said, what does this all mean? And he said, look, there are people out there that just hate Jews. And sometimes their religions teach them to do that. Sometimes not. But it's a fact of life. And while you don't see it on a systemic basis, you used to see it on a systemic basis in this country, you still see it. Just go on the internet and go to what I call Jewish Twitter. Follow a few of our folks, and you'll see, what's going on out there.
Mm-hmm. No, and obviously, and we refer to our country oftentimes as Judeo-Christian, but in many ways it is more the Christian than the Judeo part of that.
That's a whole topic for a whole other time. We can talk about that, for a while. But yes,
yeah.
This country was founded on a concept of religious freedom. George Washington, in a very famous letter in, I believe, 1787, I'm going to get that wrong, writes to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, basically expressing the government and the United States' openness and embrace of the Jewish community as part and parcel of religious freedom in this country. But it took a long time to make those words a reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You had mentioned earlier about the No Hate Act. So the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, obviously part of that, you've already mentioned Charlottesville, Heather Heyer, who was tragically killed by someone who drove his car into that crowd and took her life. But a large part of, maybe talk a little bit about the act. A large part of that is actually around the data and how important that data is to promote collection, utilization, and how does the data drive the policy?
Well, I mean, first of all, did you know that Heather Heyer's death, her murder, was not considered a hate crime in Virginia?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, it wasn't filed as a hate crime. Now, if that's not a hate crime, I don't know what is. The woman's dead, and these folks are there essentially to intimidate and to call out people of other faiths and ethnic groups, and Jews and blacks. And if that's not a hate crime, I don't know what is. What No Hate tries to do is to fix that problem through a number of ways, but one of the ways is through data. You can't solve a problem, as I said earlier, if you don't know what it is. And through collection of data, we hope that the FBI will have more resources to be able to better prosecute and bring these folks to justice and send a message that you can't get away with this stuff in the United States. Now, the bill was incorporated into the first version of the HEROES Act, which passed the House, but didn't go anywhere in the Senate. And I know this week the Congress is looking at some COVID relief bills. I don't know if they'll roll No Hate into them. It's our hope that we can get this bill passed both in the House and in the Senate. It's a bipartisan bill in the House. We're still looking for a Republican co-sponsor in the Senate. I believe we will find one. And if it doesn't pass in this Congress, we're going to come back in the next Congress and make sure it gets done.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of the challenge of getting this passed and anything in this area actually goes back to something you mentioned earlier about education, about telling people about what is anti-Semitism, what is our history as communities, whether it's the Jewish community history or the Japanese American community history. One of the challenges, obviously, that we are actually maybe actually I'm going to flow there again. Um, One of the things that was interesting about the survey that you guys did was about the knowledge that Americans now have about the Holocaust. There are a couple questions about that as well. And what are your thoughts about that? About either what I said, the knowledge about the Holocaust, or perhaps it's a lack of knowledge about the Holocaust.
Yeah, what we found was that only 37% of the general public said that they know a great deal about the Holocaust. And the less education someone has, the less they know. Now, that seems self-evident, uh, but with all the programs and all of the history classes in the United States that attempt, as part of their World War II history, to talk about the Shoah, the Holocaust, the fact that people don't know very much about it is really chilling. There was another survey that came out, I think by CNN a year ago in September, and some huge amount of millennials could not identify even one concentration camp, which was a shocking statistic to me. Um, and we need to do more. We need to do more in education. We also need to bring the lessons of the Holocaust and make them relevant to people today. And while the Holocaust is a singular tragedy, a third of the Jews were wiped out during the Holocaust. Um, Hate and bigotry, didn't stop at the gates of Auschwitz. Um, all of our communities have seen what this kind of bigotry and racism can do. And the lessons of the Holocaust, of resilience, of stepping back, stepping out, I guess is what I'd rather say, standing up to that, are really important. Whether it's 2020 or it's 1950, the lessons are there to be learned. And I think it's really critical that people need to learn them and incorporate them into their own lives.
Mhm. No, we actually have another question about the usefulness of education, but as you sort of alluded to, a lot of times this hate is something that is taught in the household. It's taught from family members. How can we combat that through our broader education efforts? How can we get through what they're hearing in the one ear at home, but obviously hearing something more positive when they are at school or in other venues?
It's a really good question, because we all know that what parents say and think really does make an impact on kids. It's really the most important voice that a child hears. And whether it's their teachers or it's athletes or it's politicians, um, they don't come up to the level of um, of the influencer that a parent is. And so we need to influence the influencers. It's important that our public figures, whether it's elected officials or it's teachers or it's athletes or others, lift up these anti-hate, anti-bigotry messages. I think the NFL, the NBA, a number of these big sports clubs, leagues have stepped up and tried to deliver those messages because their players demanded it. When it comes to anti-Semitism, for example, there's something called the working definition of anti-Semitism. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. It's a definition that's been adopted by over 20 countries and institutions like Oxford and Stanford and places around the world. But the English Premier League, the most important sports institution in Great Britain, adopted the IRA definition a couple of weeks ago. And that will go a long way to raise the profile of anti-Semitism and encourage people to engage with the lessons of the Holocaust. And it's something that we're working on at a variety of levels to continue to spread that information and get people to understand. And once the parents understand, hopefully, it will trickle down to their children who are hearing it in school.
Mhm. And I think, and when we talk about education, so often both when we talk about the Holocaust, when we talk about the Japanese American experience, a lot of the power of that education process is oftentimes relying upon firsthand accounts of what had happened.
Yep.
unfortunately, we're now 70 some years out from that period, and we are obviously losing a lot of those people who can go into the schools, who can meet with people one-on-one and actually make that connection as to what did this really mean to me as a person when it was happening. Um, what can we do to make sure that we're able to carry on that type of connection to the actual experience, as we are losing so many of the survivors now?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. One of the highlights of my career over the last, 30 years has been the privilege of going with Holocaust survivors to schools and to public fora and, into people's homes and helping for them to tell their stories. Museums are a critical part of storytelling. And many museums now actually have this holographic technology where they're videoing survivors telling their stories and capturing it holographically so that people can interact with a survivor at least in a way that isn't just reading something on a board or seeing a photo. It's not the same. You
Mhm.
can't ask the questions in the same way you would ask. You can't get that emotional connection. Films are good in this way, accurate films, historically accurate films. But I think the museums and the schools, you're right. We are losing our survivors, really our greatest generation, and it's tragic, and we need to do everything we can to preserve their legacy and their history.
Mhm. Now you'd mentioned the importance of museums. There's a piece of legislation that just recently passed, the Holocaust Education Act. Could maybe talk a little bit about that? And obviously, we in the Japanese American community have actually taken that to model another similar type of legislation that we're actually working on, which I'll talk about after you.
Sure. No, and I'd love to learn more about your legislation. And the Holocaust Education Act did just what I was talking about. I think it helped undergird museums and give them the ability to tell these stories more effectively. Also integrated into school curricula, mandating the teaching in schools of this stuff. I mean, there were certain schools that just don't teach the Holocaust. I mean, I don't know if you heard down in Florida, there was a principal who was fired, then rehired, and then fired again because he wouldn't commit to saying that the Holocaust was a historic event, that it actually
Mhm.
happened. We need to do better. And this type of legislation it is very helpful in that way. It helps teachers make those good decisions and know what to teach and how to teach. But I'm curious to know more about the legislation you are behind.
Yeah, so essentially it is modeled after that Holocaust Education Act. It's called the Japanese American Confinement Education Act. It was introduced by Congresswoman Matsui, who herself is a camp survivor. And that was introduced in October. But it does two main things. First, it actually reauthorizes an existing program, the Japanese American Confinement Sites Program, which is a grant program that's been in existence for several years now, has distributed over $32 million to over almost 250 different programs. It's and it's also so it reauthorizes that program with an additional $38 million in funding, because obviously we're getting close to the $38 million that was originally authorized. But to build upon the Holocaust Education Act, it creates another $10 million to fund this Japanese American education program, which would be similarly museum-based, and it would be to sort of develop a broader curriculum that could be further distributed out to schools, to other institutions, and really pull the Japanese American community together to really help us work together to build a stronger curriculum that could be used. Because we face the same issue where you have Holocaust denialism. And there are a lot of people who don't even know that we had concentration camps here in our own country during the war.
Yep.
Obviously on a very different scale, and thankfully they were not death camps. They weren't work camps, as they were euphemistically called in Europe. But at the same time, we did sort of something very similar in that we were placing people into camps, and people just are not aware of that. So the idea is that this would really kind of institutionalize the teaching of our own history in the United States from that World War II history, and hopefully preserve it for future generations, just as we need to do with Holocaust education. That
Sure.
it is something
Mm.
that is ongoing, and we need people to continue to learn about it.
Well, obviously, internment is a terrible stain on our country's history, and I can't agree with you more that any way that you know our society can help teach that story uh, is extremely important and important to support.
Yeah, and when we talk about obviously bringing our experiences, our history to the present, and ensuring that people still learn about it, there are so many ways in which our stories can inform policymakers today around so many of the issues today. And where do you see the need for people to really recognize the wrongs of what happened in the past when we look at some of the um, current injustices that are happening in society?
Yeah, it's a very good question because I think they're intertwined. Um, you know, the book says there's nothing new under the sun. You know, racism in this country has gone back a very long way. Anti-Asian bias, anti-Semitism goes back a very long way, and we're seeing it in different forms now. We're seeing, having it have a different face or a different methodology to deliver, but the prescriptions are still the same. The prescriptions of building a stronger, more civil society, a society that is based on nuance and finding common ground, not listening to the loudest voices necessarily, the most extreme voices, and really marginalizing the haters. Sometimes people lift up the voices of the very people who are looking to tear down our country. Can't do that anymore. We're in a tough spot right now. And if we can lift up the voices of people that bring us together and come together ourselves, and I know it sounds pie in the sky, but it's actually true. That's how you build a strong community. It's done one, at least pre-COVID, one handshake at a time. It's done with shoe leather. It's done with being in one another's spaces. It's about doing programs like these where we can hear one another and share our experiences together. Otherwise, Bruce Springsteen wrote a song once called 57 Channels and Nothing On. We're living in this society where each of us are building our own bubble reality, not only our COVID bubbles, but where we get our information, and it's getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And if we continue along that road, we're going to see populism, we're going to see pitting people against one another as a form of success in government really take over. And we can't afford to let that happen.
Mm-hmm. No, I think, and one thing I've been talking a lot about lately with others is, for many of us who are very much in favor of immigration reform and everything, when we hear the words "build the wall," and that is it's a red flag. It just sets up. You shut down. It creates. It's to both incite, obviously, on the other side, but it's to make us angry on the other side. Similarly, and when we talk about justice reform, when we talk about defund the police, it's the exact same effect where it essentially shuts down the debate. And I think what you had mentioned earlier, that AJC likes to live in the nuance, and that you can't have a nuanced discussion when you are building your arguments around a three-word slogan like "build the wall" or "defund the police."
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we're living on a bumper sticker now.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't get it out in 1 second, you can't have public policy. I mean, the best bumper sticker I ever saw was a very simple one. It said no. And we're getting to that point now where, like you just said, if we cannot articulate in a jingle or sort of a jingoism kind of thing, people aren't going to pay attention, and that's really a problem.
It's policy by Twitter now. 100, was
Yes.
it 168 characters or less? I forget exactly what the limit is, but
Yeah.
it's not enough to articulate a real policy.
No. I mean, nuances of societal value, and we need to lift it up as what made America what America is. It was the ability to take these disparate groups of people. And yeah, I mean, it's not perfect, and it certainly has, potholes along the way, but conceptually, the idea is to bring people together and find that nuanced relationship. People don't have to give up who they are, and at the same time, they have to enter into a social contract, a nuanced contract, so that we can live together amicably. And that's the challenge, I think, of our generation.
Yeah. I think that's a great note to end on. Actually, we are coming to the end of our hour. But Alan, I really want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. Thank you to everyone in our audience today. I want to just take a moment to remind everyone that today is JCL Membership Tuesday. So if you're not yet a member of JCL, consider joining today to help support programming like this, and so that we can work with organizations like AJC here in Washington, D.C., and bring us all together like this. Joining will also allow you to join our end of the year membership call in 2 weeks with our special guest, George Takei, who some of you may be familiar with. So go to our website at jcl.org to join or renew your membership, or you could also give a membership as a gift. And for more information about AJC and how to support them as well, go to ajc.org. So thank you all for joining us, and everyone have a blessed holidays. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
David.
Alan.
Take care.
Thank you.